There are nights when the world holds its breath, nights when the air itself feels thin, charged with something old and hungry. Look up, see that silver coin hanging in the velvet black. Most see just the moon, a cold, distant observer, but some of us see the tide turning, the slow, inevitable pull of a power far older than cities, older than memory they call it, by different names, in hushed tones around dying fires. The wolf moon, the hunter's moon, names that speak of instinct, of the wild heart, but there is one name, one celestial event that strikes a different kind of fear, a primal dread that sinks into the marrow of your bones. The blood moon, not just any lunar phase, but a total lunar eclipse, when the earth stands between the sun and the moon, casting its shadow upon that familiar orb, and the light that filters through our atmosphere, it paints the moon in shades of rust and deepest crimson, a bleeding eye in the sky. For centuries, across cultures, the blood moon has been a harbinger of change, of upheaval, of the veil between worlds growing thin. They spoke of ill omens, of spirits stirring, of madness descending. But for those bound to the rhythm of the moon, for those whose very flesh answers its call, for them, the blood moon is not just a sign, it is the catalyst, the crucible. Have you ever felt it? That strange restlessness as the light begins to dim. That tightening in your chest, like something is pushing its way out. That sudden, inexplicable urge to run, to howl at the indifferent sky. The stories whisper of a night when the moon itself bleeds, a blood moon eclipse. And under that crimson gaze, something ancient stirs within the cursed. The true terror, witnessing the werewolf transformation under blood moon eclipse. It's not merely a change of form, it's a descent, a surrender, a raw, visceral unleashing of primal force that defies understanding. What happens when the very light that governs their change turns blood red? When the gentle pull becomes a violent, irresistible yank? What anatomical horrors unfold? What ancient instincts are dragged from the deepest parts of the psyche? This isn't just folklore. This is the heart of the myth, stripped bare the moment the human cracks and the beast reigns supreme. We are about to step into that shadow, to witness the terrifying beauty, the agonizing power of that specific cursed night. If you've ever felt that chill, that pull of the wild, perhaps you understand the gravity of this moment. If you're still here, listening to these old whispers, leave a mark. Let me know you heard, because the night is falling, and the moon is bleeding, and something is coming. The air itself thickens, it presses down, heavy and charged, carrying the scent of damp earth and something else, something wild, something ancient. The world outside the windows, the familiar woods, the quiet fields, begins to lose its friendly edges. Shadows stretch and writhe, no longer just absence of light, but entities with form and intent. The wind doesn't just blow. It whispers, a low, sibilant sound that seems to carry secrets just beyond comprehension. The crimson light from the moon, now fully bleeding across the sky, isn't like normal moonlight. It's not silver and cool. It's a hot, throbbing pulse that paints the landscape in unsettling hues of red and black. It feels invasive. It's not just illuminating the world, but seeping into it, staining everything it touches. And for those who carry the ancient mark, it feels like it's seeping into them inside, where the human shell still holds sway. The strange phenomena escalate from subtle unease to undeniable disturbance. The heart, already quickened by the earlier dread, begins a frantic, irregular beat. A drum solo of impending panic. Muscles twitch involuntarily, a deep, aching restlessness settling into the limbs, a need to move, to run, to escape this suffocating stillness. The senses, usually reliable anchors, begin to betray. Sounds from outside are suddenly amplified, the snap of a twig miles away, the distant cry of a nightbird, the scuttling of unseen things in the undergrowth, all assaulting the ears with jarring clarity. Smells become overwhelmingly potent, the metallic temps of blood, the musky scent of animal, the sharp electric smell of ozone that precedes a storm. Everything is too loud, too sharp, too much. This sensory overload is the first wave of attack on the mind. Thoughts, once clear, become fragmented, erratic, a primal. Fog begins to roll in, obscuring logic, pushing reason to the edges of consciousness. The calm, rational self struggles against a rising tide of instinct, run, hide, hunt. These are not thoughts, but impulses, raw and demanding. Echoing from a place deep within the genetic memory, the setting outside mirrors the internal chaos. The woods surrounding the lonely cabin seem to lean in, the trees becoming skeletal figures in the blood-red light. The air grows colder, sharper, biting at exposed skin. Even the familiar sounds of the night, crickets, owls, seem distorted, twisted into something menacing. The world is becoming hostile, alien, reflecting the terrifying transformation beginning within. Doubt creeps in, cold and insidious. Is this real? Am I losing my mind? Is this just the stress, the eerie light? The rational mind desperately seeks an explanation, a way to dismiss the escalating terror as mere delusion, but the physical sensations are undeniable. The burning under the skin, the ache in the bones, the terrifying clarity of the amplified senses. This isn't just fear. It's a fundamental change. A biological response to the celestial trigger. Paranoia takes root, twisting the doubt into a chilling certainty. Every shadow is a threat, every sound is a predator, approaching. But the deepest paranoia isn't about what's outside, it's about what's inside. The dawning, horrifying realization that you are the threat, that the thing stirring within is not a separate entity, but a part of yourself, awakened and amplified by the blood moon's cursed energy. The psychological signals intensify. The internal struggle becomes a battleground. The human consciousness fights for control, clinging to identity, to memory, to the life it knows. But the beast, fueled by the blood moon's potent influence, is rising, its power overwhelming, its demands absolute. The ancient curse, the lycanthropy, is asserting its dominance. Triggered by the unique alignment of lunar forces, the familiar world recedes, replaced by a hyper-real, terrifying landscape filtered through heightened animalistic senses. The smell of prey is intoxicating. The urge to run on all fours is almost unbearable. The desire to tear and rend, to howl at the crimson orb in the sky, becomes a burning need. This is the precipice, the moment before the fall. The last vestiges of humanity, grappling with the unleashed primal force. The mystery isn't just what the blood moon does to the werewolf, it's what it does to the human trapped inside. It's the slow, agonizing unraveling of self, the descent into a nightmare where the monster isn't under the bed, but clawing its way out from within. The strangeness has escalated. The setting turned hostile. The psychological signals are screaming, and the doubt has curdled into a horrifying certainty. The transformation is coming, and under this moon, it will be unlike anything seen before. The guttural sounds are no longer just internal vibrations. They're escaping, low rumbles tearing at the back of the throat. The whimper is a dying echo of humanity, lost in the rising tide of something ancient and savage. The air, thick and charged, under the blood moon's eerie glow, feels like a physical weight pressing down, accelerating the terrifying process. The hand, it's not right. The fingers feel too long, too thick. A sudden, sharp crack echoes in the silence. The sound of bone shifting, realigning. A wave of nausea washes over you, but it's quickly replaced by a surge of raw animalistic energy. This is it, the thought screams in your mind. A desperate final plea for denial. It's happening. The world outside, bathed in the blood moon's surreal light, seems to warp and distort. The familiar trees in the yard twist into menacing shapes, their shadows elongating into grasping claws. The distant howl of a coyote, usually a lonely sound, now feels like a challenge, a call to arms. Your eyes, wide and frantic, dart around, but they aren't just seeing, they're hunting. Everything is reduced to movement, heat, scent, the scent of fear, your own. This isn't how you see, this isn't how you are. The human mind reels, trying to impose logic on the chaos, but the senses are lying, or rather, they're telling a different truth. One of instinct and predator, not reason and man. It's a terrifying glitch in perceived reality. The familiar world seen through the eyes of a creature it was never meant to contain. The contradiction is jarring, horrifying. Your own living room is alien territory. No, stop it. Fight it. The internal voice is weaker now, a whisper against the roaring storm building inside. Don't let the moon, the growl escapes. Raw and powerful, it's not you yet. It is you. The horrifying truth settles like a shroud. There is no it, there is only the transformation. The unleashing of primal instincts amplified by the blood moon's potent energy. The struggle isn't against an external demon, it's against the ancient, terrifying power coiled within. Awakened by the unique confluence of the lunar eclipse and the creature's cursed bloodline, pain flares, a searing, tearing sensation across the back and shoulders, muscles bulge and tear. Skin stretches taut to the breaking point, a whimper of agony escapes, quickly swallowed by another involuntary growl. Laced with rising furia, the tearing cloth is a physical manifestation of the internal rupture. The human skin, the human form, is no longer sufficient, it must give way. The blood moon eclipse hangs in the sky. A malevolent eye, its crimson light, flooding the room, seeming to pour fuel onto the fire raging within. It's not just triggering the change, it's supercharging it, pushing it beyond the usual agony, accelerating the descent into the beast. The world shrinks further, narrowing to the immediate. The primal fear is still there, a cold knot in the gut, but it's warring with a fierce, exhilarating surge of power. The need to run, to hunt, to be the monster is becoming overwhelming. The mind, the human self, is losing ground rapidly. The grip on reality is slipping, replaced by a terrifying clarity of purpose that belongs to something else entirely. Hands no, pause. The urge to drop to all fours is immense. Driven by instinct, the floorboards feel rough and real under palms that are rapidly changing, thickening, nails hardening and elongating into claws. This is who I am now. The thought is not resignation, but a chilling, dawning acceptance, tainted with the beast's rising hunger. The terror is still present, a cold dread, but it's being drowned out by the roaring power. The raw potential. The fight is ending, the surrender is beginning. The emotional pattern of desperate struggle is breaking, giving way to the terrifying, inevitable embrace of the beast. The werewolf transformation under the blood moon eclipse is no longer a distant threat. It is a terrifying, undeniable reality tearing its way out from within. The surrender is beginning. The werewolf transformation under the blood moon eclipse is no longer a distant threat. It is a terrifying, undeniable reality tearing its way out from within. The tearing intensifies not just cloth now, but skin. A searing, impossible pain, like fire spreading across every nerve ending. Every stretched pore muscles knot and bulge, shifting bone structure with sickening pops and grinding sounds. The spine curves, elongating ribs expand, creating a wider, deeper chest cavity. Hands flatten, knuckles thickening, fingers fusing slightly, as claws erupt from the nail beds, black and sharp as obsidian slivers. The sound is a symphony of organic destruction and rapid, forced reconstruction. A low, guttural moan is ripped from the throat, no longer human in pitch or tone. The previously just a room becomes a cage, too small to still. The air is thick with the coppery temps of blood, my blood, leaking from a dozen small ruptures in the rapidly changing skin. The smell of dust, of wood, of damp earth from outside, all assault the burgeoning senses with overwhelming intensity. Every sound is amplified. The creak of the floorboards under shifting weight, the frantic thumping of a heart that feels too large for the chest, the distant, mournful howl of something else, something kindred, called by the same crimson eye in the sky. The head twists, the jaw cracking, reforming. The teeth elongate, sharpen. The nose pushes forward into a snout, wet and sensitive, drinking in the world in a new, terrifying way. Vision blurs, then sharpens into a predatory focus. Colors muted except for the stark contrast of shadow and the terrifying, all-consuming red light pouring through the window. The world is suddenly sharp, dangerous, and mine to dominate. But amidst the physical agony and the sensory onslaught, something else is happening. The blood moon's light isn't just a trigger, it's a lens. It's focusing the primal energy, directing it not just at the body, but at the mind. And as the human consciousness is overwhelmed, the beast isn't just inheriting a body, it's inheriting the ghosts within it. A memory, sharp and agonizing, surges forward. Not a general fear, but a specific, terrible moment. The smell of rain-soaked earth, the sound of a child crying, the feeling of helplessness, of being frozen, unable To move, unable to save it, was a moment of profound failure. A scar etched deep into the human soul under the blood moon. That scar isn't just remembered, it's amplified. It becomes the core directive for the nascent beasts. The primal instinct to hunt, to kill, is there, raw and powerful, but it's being twisted, warped by this forced memory, this unleashed trauma. The beast doesn't just want to destroy, it wants to protect what it lost. It wants to lash out at the source of that helplessness. Real or imagined, the red light of the eclipse feels like a physical weight, pressing this trauma deeper, forging it into the very essence of the creature. The transformation is reaching its peak. The human form is gone, replaced by a hulking, fur-covered nightmare of muscle and fang. But this isn't just a werewolf, this is my werewolf, tainted by my deepest wound, fueled by the malevolent glow of the blood moon. The stakes have flipped. It's no longer just about surviving the change. It's about surviving what the change has become. It's about whether the last vestiges of the human mind can control a beast whose rage is now anchored to a specific, agonizing past. The world is a kaleidoscope of hyperreal sensations. The scent of fear, sharp and intoxicating. The sound of a distant heartbeat, miles away, but clear, as if in the same room. The sight of shadows dancing, shifting, becoming potential threats. But overriding it all is the burning intensity of that memory. The helplessness, the failure. A surge of pure, unadulterated rage, born from grief and failure, floods the system. The beast doesn't understand why, not in human terms. It just feels the betrayal, the loss, the need to prevent it ever happening again. It's a terrifying, instinctual drive, magnified 1,000-fold by the blood moon's power. The human consciousness is a tiny, flickering candle in a hurricane of primal fury. It screams internally, a silent plea against the beast's rising dominance. No, don't. That's not real. But the beast doesn't listen. It acts on feeling, on instinct, on the overwhelming, trauma-fueled imperative. Something is destroyed, an object, a piece of furniture, something. The beast's twisted perception links to the traumatic memory. The act brings no relief, only a momentary surge of savage satisfaction, quickly replaced by the persistent, gnawing ache of the unleashed wound. This is the true horror of the blood moon eclipse. It doesn't just unleash the beast, it weaponizes your deepest pain. It turns your own trauma against the world. Using the werewolf as its terrifying instrument, the creature pacing the room, testing its new strength, is not just a monster. It's a living, breathing manifestation of a broken heart, fueled by cosmic power. There's a recording device running, forgotten in the chaos, perhaps a phone knocked onto the floor. Its camera still pointed vaguely at the scene. The human mind, fighting its last stand, sees it a final chance, a desperate act of defiance against the inevitably sliver of human will, seizes control of the vocal cords. For a fleeting second, a sound is forced out, raspy, wet, barely recognizable as speech. It's directed at the device, at the lens, at anyone who might ever find this. If you're still watching, get away. The human voice tries again, more desperate, faster. Don't look at the moon, don't let it see you. The connection is severed, the human is gone. Perhaps for good, perhaps buried deep within the snarling, trauma-driven creature that now stands fully transformed under the blood moon. Eclipse. The beast is in control, its actions no longer just predatory, but driven by a primal, twisted response to a pain it cannot understand. Only act upon. The hunt has begun, but the prey might be anything that reminds the beast of its human host's deepest, most agonizing failure. The night is long, and the blood moon shines red. The beast stands, fully realized, a silhouette against the unnaturally large, crimson disk hanging in the sky. Its head swivels, ears twitching, taking in the world with senses sharper than any human could comprehend. The scent of fear, the vibration of distant traffic, the subtle shift in air currents. It's all a flood, overwhelming, yet somehow focused by the singular driving impulse born from the human's broken core. There's a new kind of clock ticking now, not the measured pulse of human time, but the slow, inexorable creep of the moon across the sky. The blood moon is at its zenith, its power a tangible weight pressing down, fueling the transformation, demanding action. The beast feels it. This window of absolute power is finite. Dawn is a distant, unwelcome thought, but the peak intensity, the raw, unbound strength, is here. Now there is a primal understanding that whatever must be done before the red light begins to fade. This is the countdown. Etched not in seconds, but in the moon's slow journey towards the horizon. A low growl vibrates in the beast's chest. A sound of frustration, of something missing. The human memory, fragmented and distorted by the change, searches for a connection. A presence that should be near. The scent it seeks isn't here. The familiar heartbeat isn't within earshot. Any echo of human companionship, any fragile thread of connection that might have anchored the transformation, is gone, vanished, perhaps driven away by the initial, terrifying shift, or simply unseen. Irrelevant to the beast's new reality, the realization hits, not with sorrow, but with a sharp, animalistic frustration. The world is reduced to predator and potential prey, and the only constant is the gnawing ache, the twisted trauma that now serves as its compass. Allies. The concept is meaningless. There is only the hunt, fueled by panda. Beast paces its heavy paws, silent on the floor, then launches itself onto a nearby surface. Eyes scanning the street below, the red light paints everything in hues of blood and shadow. A movement catches its eye, a distant shape, too small, too fast, not the target its trauma demands. It drops back down, restless. The energy of the blood moon thrumming through its veins. Then a scent, faint but familiar, a scent linked to a different time, a different place, a memory that flickers at the edge of the beast's awareness. It's a scent of safety, of a brief respite from the pain. It pulls at the beast, a strange countercurrent to the overwhelming drive to lash out for a fleeting second. The beast hesitates, its ears swivel, trying to pinpoint the source. It takes a step towards the direction the scent is strongest. A low whine replacing the growl. Could this be it? A way out of the red haze, a return to something less. This is the false hope, a cruel mirage conjured by the vestiges of the human mind. Or perhaps a trick of the blood moon itself, highlighting what is lost to emphasize the terror of what remains. The scent leads towards an alley, dark and narrow, offering a potential path away from the main street. A chance to disappear into the shadows, but the blood moon hangs heavy. Its red light not just illuminating the world, but shaping the beast's perception. The scent of safety twists, becoming tinged with something else. Vulnerability. The narrow alley is not an escape. It's a choke point, an ambush location. The primal instincts, sharpened to an impossible degree by the lunar cycle's peak power, recognize the danger, but the trauma-driven impulse overrides caution. The pain demands confrontation, not escape. The fleeting hope of finding solace is crushed under the weight of the beast's true, terrible purpose. The whine becomes a snarl, the hesitation vanishes, the beast rears back, its powerful legs bunching, ready to leap, not away, but towards the night, towards the source of the pain its human half could not bear. The scent is forgotten, replaced by the overwhelming urge to hunt, to tear, to resolve the agony in the only way the beast knows how, through violence. The countdown continues, the blood moon pushing the creature towards its inevitable, terrifying actions. The false hope was just another step in the escalation, cementing the beast's isolation and its terrifying purpose. Under the crimson sky, the world outside waits, unaware of the trauma-fueled engine of destruction that is about to be unleashed upon it. The powerful legs coiled, then exploded, not away, but towards the unknown. The potential threat, the only target the beast's fractured mind could now comprehend it, launched itself into the night. A blur of fur and muscle against the stark, crimson backdrop of the blood moon. Eclipse. The air rushed past, cold and sharp, carrying the sense of the city, fear, exhaust fumes. Something metallic and coppery that made the beast's mouth water, landing with a jarring impact on the cobblestones of the main street. The beast wasn't just a creature anymore, it was the embodiment of the night's terror. A living nightmare made real by the celestial event overhead. The werewolf transformation under the blood moon eclipse was complete. Not just physically, but spiritually. The last flicker of human consciousness, the fragile thread of identity that had sought solace, had snapped under the unbearable pressure. What remained was pure instinct, amplified to a deafening roar by the lunar energy. Its eyes, now glowing embers in the low light, scanned the street. The world was a tapestry of scents and sounds, each detail screaming for attention. The distant siren, the scuttling of a rat in the gutter, the frantic beat of a human heart nearby, all were magnified. Overwhelming, but one scent dominated, drawing the beast forward with an irresistible pull. The scent of vulnerability, of potential prey. It wasn't the specific individual that mattered. It was the essence of their fear, a beacon in the darkness that resonated with the beast's own trauma, and Pennet moved with terrifying speed and grace. A predator finally unleashed the earlier hesitation. The internal conflict was gone, replaced by a singular, brutal clarity. Hunt, kill, obliterate the source of the internal agony by inflicting it outwards. The streetlights cast long, distorted shadows, but the blood moon's glow painted everything in shades of red and black. A monochrome world, perfectly suited for the monster it had created. Day figure emerged from a doorway down the street, silhouetted against the dim interior light. They were alone, perhaps heading home late. Unaware of the horror stalking the shadows, the beast froze, its body tensing, a low growl vibrating deep in its chest. This was it, the culmination of the transformation, the release of the pent-up agony. The myth wasn't just about the change. It was about the action that followed, the inevitable consequence of such raw, unbound power, fueled by the malevolent light of the lunar cycle's peak. The figure stopped, sensing something was wrong. They looked up, their eyes wide, fixing on the hulking shape moving towards them. A gasp, a choked cry, fear, pure and potent, flooded the air for the beast. It was a signal, an invitation. The scent intensified, overpowering everything else. The pain inside surged, demanding release, demanding resolution. With a guttural roar that tore through the unnatural silence of the street, the beast charged. It wasn't running. It was a force of nature, a crimson-eyed blur of fur and claws, driven by millennia of primal instinct and the immediate, crushing weight of unbearable suffering. The distance closed in seconds. The figure screamed. A sound abruptly cut short. There was a sickening thud, a wet, tearing sound, and then silence. The beast stood over the crumpled form, its chest heaving. The coppery scent was overwhelming now, thick and metallic. It lowered its head, sniffing the air, a low whine escaping its throat. The pain, it wasn't gone. The act had provided a fleeting, brutal distraction, a momentary release of pressure. But the fundamental agony remained, a constant thrum beneath its skin. The blood moon hung high, its red light bathing the scene in a horrifying, infernal glow. It had promised power, transformation, the unleashing of the wild, and it had delivered the myth of the werewolf transformation under a blood moon. Eclipse wasn't just a story of physical change. It was a tragedy of lost control, of primal instincts overwhelming humanity, of a celestial event unlocking the darkest potential within. The irreversible act had been committed. There was no turning back. The path was set. The creature, now fully the beast, raised its head to the crimson sky. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the sound of its ragged breathing and the distant, fading wail of a siren. The world outside waited, still largely unaware of the terrifying engine of destruction that had just claimed its first victim. A chilling testament to the potent, horrifying power of the blood moon. The beast was no longer just transforming. It was being, fully and terribly, under the crimson eye of the eclipse. The coppery tang lingered, thick and cloying in the air. The beast stood over the silent form, chest heaving, the initial blinding surge of the kill receding, leaving behind not satisfaction, but a vast, echoing emptiness. The intense pressure that had driven the charge eased, a momentary lull in the storm of agony. But it was a false calm. The primal hunger was momentarily sated, yes, but the underlying torment, the searing fire beneath the coarse fur, remained. It wasn't relief. It was just silence. Where the screaming had been, it lowered its massive head, sniffing the air again, not the scent of blood this time, but the damp asphalt, the distant exhaust fumes. The subtle fear pheromones carried on the wind. Every smell was a shout, every sound a hammer blow. The heightened senses, amplified to a terrifying degree by the blood moon's energy, were a torment, not a gift. This wasn't power. It was overwhelming, incapacitating noise and sensation. The creature wasn't a perfectly tuned hunter. It was a being drowning in a chaotic storm of sensory input, driven by instinct because rational thought was impossible in this maelstrom. Low whine escaped its throat, a sound that held no menace, Only confusion and a deep, abiding misery was this, the enhanced state promised by the legends. This chaotic storm of sensation and instinct. This hollow ache where pain had been. The werewolf transformation under a blood moon eclipse wasn't the apotheosis of the creature. It was its damnation. The lunar eclipse hadn't just changed the form. It had poured raw, unfiltered lunar energy into its very being, bypassing the natural checks and balances of a normal transformation. Unleashing the primal engine without the guiding hand of even basic animal cunning, let alone human intelligence. It was a force of nature, yes, but a broken, suffering one. The blood moon hung, a silent, indifferent eye in the inky sky. It had promised power, shown the path to ultimate freedom from human constraints, but the freedom it offered was the freedom of the wild animal, not the noble predator of myth, but the cornered, terrified beast, lashing out blindly against a world that had suddenly become a hostile, alien place. The distant wail of sirens grew louder. A siren song promising confrontation. The beast lifted its head, its crimson eyes no longer burning with predatory fire, but reflecting a raw animal fear. Fixed on the source of the sound, the momentary stillness was over. The night had just begun. The true horror wasn't the transformation itself, but what the blood moon had made of it. It had taken a creature of myth and turned it into a tragedy. A terrifying engine of destruction, fueled by agony and confusion. A chilling testament to the darker side of the werewolf transformation under a blood moon eclipse. This wasn't the end of the story for the beast, but the beginning of its nightmare. And the worlds the eclipse had passed its peak. The blood moon would eventually fade, but the market left, the terrible potential it had unlocked, that would Lingaryov, seen the truth of the blood moon's influence. You've seen the price of the transformation. It happened here, it's real, and now you know the night is long, the shadows are deep, and the moon will return. If you want to understand the darkness that walks among us, to be ready when the sky bleeds crimson again, subscribe, join us, watch the shadows. And for those who hunger for more, step deeper into the shadows with our ultimate werewolf horror playlist linked in the description below. The world of horror. The scariest things happen when you least expect them, and, trust me, you don't want to be left in the dark. Welcome to the darkness.